Lesson 56 in the Jazz Violin series of 100. All right, in the last video, I mentioned a concept I want to expand upon here. It's the idea that in music, the most common sounding things always get the easiest symbol for us musicians. Now, is this because we're just too dumb to figure it out elsewhere, other ways? No, it doesn't mean that. It means this. It outlines this concept, that your real job as a musician is not to just play your instrument and play it perfectly in tune with a good tone, this kind of thing. Your real job, if you want to talk Star Trek language, your prime directive is to emote. All right? Your prime job as a musician is to emote something, to give yourself and the audience a feeling from the music you play. Now that can come from the tone you use. It could come from the notes you choose. It could come from many sources. It could come just from your own guts and the attack you have in a note or whatever. It's all the combination, but that's the prime directive is to emote something. Now, if that's our prime objective in playing music, thinking too much gets definitely in the way of emoting. Would you agree? Most people do. So thinking too much dulls down feeling, not just in music, but in life too. Overthinkers don't necessarily are not the most passionate people. I know I've leaned that way myself in life sometimes. I know this firsthand. So the less we give you to think about, the more potential you have for emoting and doing a better job at your job number one. Make sense? It does to me. It does to most of my students. So concepts and conceptually, how we write things and talk about things, we tend to give the most common sounding things, the most used things, the simplest symbol. Chords, as we're talking about in a lot of these recent videos, is one of those examples. The most common sounding triad is a major, as opposed to minor, which is darker or diminished or augmented. But the major is, it's like walking in the daisies, right? I feel the daisies. Happy, content. It's the most common one, so it got a big capital C, capital letter. That's one example. I mentioned in a last video too, the seventh chord, prime example of the same thing. Even though it doesn't make sense, it's not from the major scale. You think the one from the major scale would be C7, but no, it's not as common sounding as when we flat the seventh. Much more common sounding, so therefore we gave that the easiest symbol, C with a 7, and you have to have the secret handshake and assume it's the flat seventh. Rhythms is another example of this. Think about it. Think about time signatures. You might know this already if you're a reader, if you're playing. 4/4 is the most common time signature. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? It's 90% of all music. There's some other meters, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, pretty common as well, but 4 is by far the most common. Whether it's heavy metal or jazz or whatever, or classical even, 4 is the most common. So we called it common time. Okay, that's easy enough. But now here's the part that doesn't make logical sense. It's only for us musicians. We call a quarter note because it's 1/4 of the most common kind of measure, a 4-beat measure, 4/4 time, common time, right? We call an eighth note because 8 of them would fit in a common 4/4 measure, the most common measure. Likewise, a 16th note, we call a half note. We think of it as 2 beats because it fills up half of the most common measure. We call a whole note because it fills up whole of the most common 4-beat measure. But now, what if we change time signatures? If we go to 3/4 time, there's only 3 beats per measure, but notice we still call the 1-beat note a quarter note, even though it's now 1/3 of the measure. It makes no sense whatsoever if logically thinking. But for us poor musicians whose number one job is to emote, we go, let's just keep it simple. Call them all quarter notes, even though it doesn't make any sense when we get to 3/4 or 6/8 or whatever other meter. We'll still call it a quarter note, even though it's named after that most common meter we're not even in anymore. There's another example where we just kept things standardized. A quarter note's always a quarter note, whether it makes any sense in other meters or not. And that's a concept we stick with, and all theory and all things explained in music will tend to be the most common sounding things get the easiest symbol. Thank God, right? If you believe in God. So there's a concept, chew on it.